God gave me the talent and the willingness to do such a thing. Because I don't have an education. Ask any of my high school teachers. They will tell you.
You were a little stinker.
Yeah, they say, I can't even believe you're still alive. Yeah, me either. Oh, we're going to talk about some, not only ghost towns, but how some of the towns in Ringgold County got their names. Because I was thinking about it one day, and I just thought it was fascinating. There are only 2 towns in the county that were named after locals. So that's kind of rare. And I just thought, why is that rare? I don't know, but we're going to look at some of those. Before Iowa became a state in 1846, it was part of the Wisconsin Territory. It became a state in 1846. Ringgold County wasn't established until 1855. Now, both Taylor County and Decatur County were established before us, and we were seen as a township of Taylor County for voting purposes until we got formally organized in May of 1855. Now, that was a big year for us, not just because we were formally recognized as a county in the state of Iowa, but 3 towns were established that year, and one of them is still alive. Mount Ayr was one of those towns. Of course, it was platted as the county seat. It was purposely put in the center of the county, and I was told the reason they did that is so that if you traveled from one county seat to the next, you could make that ride in one day. It's usually 25 miles from one county seat to the next. Not all of them followed that, because Union County, for example, Petersville was the first county seat. I don't even know where that was. Afton was the next county seat, and Creston is the current county seat. Creston stole it from Afton in 1892. So Mount Ayr, there were 2 post offices opened in 1855. One in Mount Ayr, that makes sense, it's the county seat. The other one is Reading. And we're going to get to that in a little bit if I don't run out of time. So recorded history says that Mount Ayr is named Mount because we're the highest elevation between the Missouri and Mississippi River in the lowest tier of counties. Not in the state, in the lowest tier of counties. And that often gets mixed up, and they say, oh, Mount Ayr is the highest point in the state. No. In the lowest tier of counties. And then our recorded history says that a friend or a relative suggested Ayr. Ayr is Scottish, by the way, and Ringgold County does have a large Scottish influence, which I'll touch on some more later. But I want to tell you something that Kurt Sheehay said to me. He said, you know, a lot of the towns around here were named after towns in Indiana. The only other Mount Ayr in the United States is in Indiana. Goshen in Ringgold County was named after Goshen, Indiana. And that Goshen was named after the Goshen in the book of Genesis, land of Goshen in Egypt where the Hebrews dwelt. So I got to thinking about that. Where did our names come from? And they were borrowed or stolen from other locations. We had a New Chicago. It became Kellerton. But there's another thing about towns. Mount Ayr, for example, to establish a post office, you got to fill out a form, send it to the feds or the state, and they write you back and say, okay, you're. But if Mount Ayr had said, our name is Silver Street, the feds would have wrote back and said, nope, there's already a Silver Street, pick a different name. And that happened. We'll get to that. So you had to pick a name that wasn't already in use. Shannon City. They filled out the application, sent it in, call us Shannon. The state said, or the feds, nope, there's already a Shannon. So Shannon called themselves Shannon City for that reason.
So does that mean 2 Shannons in the state, or?
There's a Shannon, Iowa that has a post office. So they couldn't be 2.
So within the state, not
in the
surrounding.
state.
Okay.
So the first residents of Mount Ayr were Barton and Laura Dunning, and Barton was the postmaster. And they had 4 children. The last one was born here. His name was Charles, so he was the first child born in Mount Ayr. All 4 of their sons became bankers, and 3 of the 4 became bank owners. So anyway, I do pay attention to that, borrowing names of towns from Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania. That's where they came from. So Mount Ayr was one of the first towns. Ringgold City. Now, Ringgold City started out being called Schooler's Grove, and it was named after Charles Schooler, who was the first white inhabitant of what would become Ringgold County. And what he started led to being Ringgold City. Now, if you don't know where Ringgold City is, go down the Sale Barn Road till you're almost to Missouri. When you can throw a rock into Missouri, turn east and go 2 miles, and you're in Ringgold City. There's nothing left of Ringgold City except the cemetery, and that is the oldest man-made site in Ringgold County, the cemetery at Ringgold. And Charles Schooler, his little settlement grew slowly, but in 1855 it was called Ringgold City, and a guy named Sanford Harrow is credited with starting that town. Of course, that got missed by the railroad, so it didn't last. But it was the first settlement in Ringgold County. And the cemetery was established in 1846. The third town that was established in 1855 is a really interesting town, Caledonia. Another Scottish name. In fact, the word Caledonia is the archaic, ancient term for Scotland. And it was supposedly used in Sir Walter Scott's Our Lady of the Lake novel, and that's where the name was taken from. That town was started by the Walter, Stuck, and Swigert families. And Peter Walter was the first postmaster there in 1856. So, of the 3 towns that started in 1855, Mount Ayr was the only one that got post office, but the next year Caledonia got one. That's how important of a settlement it was. It was on the Dragoon Trace, which was a trail used very often to go from Des Moines to Kansas City or Kansas, so it was an important trail. I don't know how the town of Eugene got its name, but it got its first post office in 1857, so only 2 years after the county was established. Eugene was very important because it was on the Underground Railroad, but also because it was a halfway point between Afton and Mount Ayr. And in the 1860s, let's say, Mount Ayr was getting its mail from Mount Pisgah, the Mormon Trail. And Mount Pisgah is about 6 miles northeast of Afton. So that's where we were going to get our mail, and then Afton got the railroad pretty early, and we were going there to get material and mail. So Eugene was the halfway point. What killed Eugene is it was halfway between Shannon City and Tingley. Those 2 towns got the railroad, Eugene didn't. But Eugene had a very early United Presbyterian Church, very early. So most congregations met in schoolhouses or homes or tents. They had an actual church building in Eugene. Eugene was a legitimate town, and they divided themselves up between Shannon City and Tingley. Goshen, then here's the first town I'm going to talk about that was created by the railroad. Goshen was the name of a post office about 1.5 miles southwest of where Diagonal is today. And Goshen was the post office for what is known as the Bethel community. And the Stahl, Talley, and Keller families started the Bethel community. They were all United Methodists. They built an early church. and they had a settlement down there by Bethel Cemetery. And then the railroad went through about 3/4 of a mile north of them. In 1882, the Humeston and Shenandoah went east-west just above them, and they moved the post office and the town, and started the town of Goshen in 1882. Goshen is really important because it became another town later. And it is in our recorded the history that Goshen, Iowa wasn't named after Goshen, Egypt. It was named after Goshen, Indiana. So a lot of the people that came here brought those names with them. More on Goshen in a while. Kellerton. Kellerton was established by the railroad. This was the CB&Q. CB&Q was in the habit of platting, hiring town companies to plat towns and establish streets and centers and commercial districts. The Chicago Great Western didn't do that. They just relied on spontaneity, and they were pretty successful at that. But the CB&Q hired town companies. They would buy the land in advance. They knew where they were going. And it was a pretty lucrative deal for them. Kellerton was named after Isaac Keller. Isaac Keller came to Ringgold County in 1856, and as far as I can tell, he didn't have much of an education or anything going for him, but he went to the Civil War, got wounded, got out early, and it turned out he was this whiz. He read law books and passed the bar, and so while the Civil War was going on, he was very instrumental in keeping Mount Air going. He was the city treasurer, he was a lawyer, he was on the county board of supervisors, he was superintendent of schools. He held a lot of positions that kept the things running and going. One of his daughters married Day Dunning, one of the bank owner's sons of the original founders of Mount Air. So he stayed very active in politics and law and organizations, and he was just an all-around do-gooder, and so they named Kellerton after him. Kellerton's other name was New Chicago, and it was located about 1/2 mile south of where Kellerton is today. And the post office they used was called Cross, which is a little north of where Kellerton is today. But it's just, I just enjoy the way that towns transform. I mean, why not keep the name New Chicago? I don't know why they didn't do that, but they didn't. When a town moved, they changed their name. So that was the first town in the county to be named after a local person. And Kellerton was the first town in the county to get the railroad, 1879. Benton, this one's tricky. Benton was started, did come into existence because of the Chicago Great Western. The name of the post office at Benton before Benton was Bloomington. And it was in the vicinity of where Benton is today, but there was a Benton Township in 1860, 1862. I forget when we went to 16 townships. We started out with 4 and it went to 16 in like 1860, 1861. So I don't know where the name Benton came from, but it was Bloomington, and the post office didn't change its name until May 1st, 1890. Regular train service began in Benton in 1888. So they were still Bloomington for like 2 years. Benton at the time was in Rice Township. It's not now. It's in Wabaunsee Township. Wabaunsee Township was created in 1916 to accommodate the Benton Independent School District. And it is a funny shaped little deal. And the officers of Wabaunsee Township were given the option a few years ago to dissolve the township and go back to 16, and they said, no, we'll keep it. So Wabaunsee Township is still there. Wabaunsee was a Potawatomi Indian who came from the Illinois, Indiana, Michigan area, and did a lot of treaties with the U.S., and fought in some wars. And then supposedly, this is what's recorded, the federal government built him a house in Lewis, Tabor, Iowa. And in 1844, supposedly, Wabunsee made his way to his new home. By the way, the next county over is Pottawatomie County. And he was a Pottawatomie Indian, but not from Iowa. So, supposedly, Wabunsee traveled through what would become Ringgold County and made his home in Tabor, around Tabor, 1844. He died about 1845 or 46. So Highway 2 in its earliest days was called the Wabunsee Trail. The town of Delphus means brother in Greek. And I don't know where that name came from. They were called Borneo. The post office was called Borneo before. But Delphus is the only town in Ringgold County that never got a bank. Every other town. And there were once 11 incorporated towns in Ringgold County, but Delphus never got it. Now Delphus came into existence in 1880 because of the railroad. It went through Mount Ayr, then down to Delphus, then Reading, then Grant City. Leesonville community. Leesonville wasn't a town, but it was a community. There was a church there and a school and a store. They never incorporated, but the railroad did go through Leesonville, but it wasn't, they didn't have a depot or a station agent. It was what you called a flag stop. If a passenger wanted to get on the train, there was a signal for the engineer, hey, there's passengers here, and the train would stop. In the old days, trains were kind of smaller and lighter and shorter, and they could stop and go. Now it'd take you an hour to stop a train and another hour to get it going. But in the old days, it was a lot easier. Another thing about the smaller trains, of course, the original railroads were built with what we call light rail, designed to hold so much weight. And as trains got bigger, longer, and heavier, that rail had to be replaced, and it was expensive and time-consuming. And it didn't have to be done once, it had to be done twice, because the trains kept getting bigger and heavier. So it was very expensive to maintain a branch line or a main line. Probably more expensive to maintain a branch line. Wirt came into existence in 1882 at the Humiston and Shenandoah, and I don't know where the name Wirt came from, but its next name, Elston, was a railroad executive, and that did happen, Blockton, Knowlton, so that did happen occasionally. And the funny thing, I read the old newspapers, the town of Elston officially changed its name January 1st, 1896. January 1st, 1896. But the railroad started calling it Elston the year before. The CB&Q, the Humiston and Shenandoah went into receivership in 1895. It means they were going broke. So the CB&Q said, hey, we'll lease you. So they leased the Humiston and Shenandoah in 1895. Here's the problem. Wirt and Van Wert were on the same railroad line, and the CB&Q didn't want to deal with that. So they said, hey, Wirt, change your name. And it got changed to Elston officially January 1st, 1896. But the railroad started using the name Elston well before that. Where was I? Leesonville. Leesonville, I think they lost their post office about 1901, but it was halfway between Mount Ayr and Kellerton, and you need a settlement every 5 miles, a church, a school, a store, so it stayed pretty active till the 30s, although I think they lost their post office in 01. You know what killed small communities like that? Rural free delivery. It devastated them. Those smaller communities. You didn't have to go to town to get your mail anymore. And you didn't buy anything because you didn't go. Another thing that killed small communities was gravel roads. Killed them. But now you can go to Mount Ayr and do your shopping. Now we drive to Des Moines to do our shopping. But Leesonville had a church, a school, store. It was a lively little settlement. Oh. Lee, I got accused of making the Lee community, I got accused of inventing that. I go, well, how does it benefit me to invent a town? Lee was about 9 miles south of Kellerton, in between Kellerton and Hatfield. I call it no man's land, because there was no highways, no trains, no nothing down there. Lots and lots of nothing. Because I don't know how Hatfield survived. They didn't get a railroad, they didn't get a state highway, and just out in the middle of nowhere. And that's what Lee was, but Lee had a hotel, a general store. They even had a baseball team. Baseball was huge. But, and like I said, like Hopeville in Clark County, you had to have a settlement every few miles. You just had to. And so Lee was in Riley Township and had a school and a church, and the store went out pretty early, but it was a community. There's still a cemetery down there. I got accused of making that up. I couldn't believe it. Next one's a little tricky, Malloy. Now, the Malloy Centennial book says Malloy was named for David Malloy. Fair enough. He was a big farmer down there. I looked him up. He was very active in the Ringgold County Agricultural Society, which sponsored the Ringgold County Fair. So David Malloy was big on breeds of cattle, and he was a judge at fairs, and he was the go-to guy for livestock. He did a lot of shipping. He's very knowledgeable. He was Flavel Malloy's grandfather, if you remember Flavel Malloy. But it's pretty rare, like I said, for a Ringgold County town to be named after a local. So I thought, why was that? And then I thought about that Reading post office back in 1855. It wasn't at the town of Reading. Reading didn't even exist. On an 1875 map, it was very near David Malloy's house. And I thought, okay, there was supposedly a stagecoach that ran between Keokuk and Nebraska City in the 1850s. So I thought that stagecoach line must have gone through that Reading post office and dropped off mail, pick up mail. So that's what I've always thought. And then just recently I came across an article that explained the early years of the Reading post office. David Malloy was never the postmaster of the Reading post office, but the post office was near his house on more than one occasion. I'm guessing that he had more to do with that community than I found in the newspapers to have a town named after him. But here's what else I found. Malloy didn't become a town until 1887 when the Chicago Great Western went through it. I called it Chicago Great Western. Its name at that time was the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City. But it was the Chicago Great Western for so long, I call it that. So I just thought, here's what I believe now. When Delphus became a town in 1880, one of the merchants from Malloy moved to Delphus, became the first postmaster. His name was Mike Rush. It's at that time, 1881, that the word Malloy appears over and over. Malloy School. You go to Malloy, the store at Malloy. It never calls Malloy a town, but it is definitely a location. And what I think is that there was a settlement there, and they called it Malloy. And then when the town actually became real, they just called it Malloy. But before Delphus was established, it was called Delphi. Malloy was called Delphi, because that was the name of the post office there. And it was also nicknamed Foxtown. The postmaster in the early 1880s was J.M. Fox. But I just think that David Malloy had a lot more to do with that area than I know about. The newspapers are kind of lacking on detail. Now that they're digitized, they're online, they got this search box, which is really cool, because the word Malloy only comes up when you're talking about David Malloy or his kids or the town. So if you get in there before the town was established, this is where I'm finding Malloy School, the store, post office at Malloy. They didn't call it the Malloy Post Office, they called it the Post Office at Malloy. So it could have been Delphi, just lacking in detail. But I just think it's really fascinating what I've been able to discover with the digitized newspapers. Otherwise, you're just surfing blindly, and it takes forever to find one item. But Malloy is the second town in the county to be named after a local. Luke Shea lived down there, by the way. The railroad came through in 1887, regular service in 1888. Luke Shea moved there in 1866, but he was Irish. Not everybody liked the Irish. And he was Catholic. Not everybody liked the Catholics. So I don't even think that was a consideration to call it Shayville or Shaytown, but Luke Shea was down in that area. Very successful farmer, had a lot of kids, and it could have been called Shayville.
Is his house the one that's on the historic register?
No, that's one of his kids.
Because I know Bobby Shea lived there,
Yeah.
but I didn't know.
Is the Lee Shea? Isn't it called the Lee Shea Farmstead?
Maybe.
Maybe it's a grandson.
Did they buy it back on a Robbie bought that, or?
I don't know. I think Luke died about 1896. That might be a grandson. I just remember it being called the Lee Shea Farmstead. And it was the first building in Ringgold County to be put on the National Register of Historic Places. And I think it was 1979.
Wow.
Reading, boy, have I spent a lot of time on this. So we're all told that Reading was established by the CB&Q. A town company came in, platted the town, and built a depot, and now we have Reading in 1880. But if you look at an 1875 plat map, there's Reading. Not New Reading, Old Reading. And the Reading post office is not in Reading. It's up by David Malloy's farm in 1875. And so what I thought, wait a minute. Why is Reading in existence in 1875? I looked in 1875, I found one paragraph on Reading. It said, a new town has been established in southwest Ringgold County, and that's Reading. No other details. So when I was reading about the Reading post office, it did say that the Reading post office was moved to Old Reading in 1878. And for whatever reason, the CB&Q went through Old Reading, but platted New Reading anyway, and built the depot in between the two towns. Now the first depot burned, but I'm sure it was in the same location as the second depot because the railroad reservoir, they couldn't have moved. And it was there in 1894. And it was still there in 1897, they drained it. But I just thought, that's weird. Another weird thing about Reading, it's the only other town besides Mount Ayr that has a town square. That's cool. I think every town should have a town square. I'll tell you what Fred Stark told me about squares. Fred Stark said that if a town had a Scottish or an English heritage, they had a town square. But if it was German or Swedish or Norwegian, they had a main street like Bedford. Bedford doesn't have a town square. Leon does, Mount Ayr does. Bedford doesn't. They have a main street. And I've never heard that before, but Fred's usually spot on, so do you know anything about that?
No, but the squares you find in Europe, you can tell Roman habitation. Because when the Romans were victorious. They always set their form of government up, and the first thing they did was they built a courthouse in the town square to do all their government business. And they squared them off, and all the streets laid off the square as Roman. So that makes sense if it came from England or Scotland.
That's what Fred said.
The Germans didn't like them at all. They kept trying to kill them, and they didn't build their cities like that. I don't think they got far enough north there to get into the Swedes. So, yeah, that's one of those things you find around the country. You go to South America. I work in South America. You can tell a lot of those cities have Roman influence because they always have the square. And I'm in mining, so I was looking at mining claims, say in Chile. Well, I got to go to the courthouse. Where is it? It's in the square. It's in the center of town. It always is. So, and their towns are laid out a lot like the towns in Iowa. Have a square like in Ringgold County, and everything lays off the sides of the square. So it's a Roman.
Dave, you've been to La Fortuna, Costa Rica?
La Fortuna, yeah.
They got it square.
I was just thinking about that, and the big, the volcano. I got a picture of
Yeah.
the Catholic Church with the volcano in the
Yeah,
background.
I took that same picture that 1 million people take.
Yeah, I'm sure they would, now that you mention it.
That was on the town square in La Fortuna, Costa Rica. I was in Trinidad. They didn't have nothing. They didn't even have coffee. Trinidad is a former British Commonwealth, so they drank tea. I said, I want coffee. But anyway, I'm sure I'm going to learn more about Reading because that's really interesting. The two post offices that were established the year that Ringgold County became a county are both still going, Reading and Mount Ayr. They were both, now the newspaper says the Reading post office was established May 5th, 1855. That was before Ringgold County was officially organized, so I doubt if that's correct. But other sources say that both Mount Ayr and Reading opened their post offices August 30th, 1855, and they're both still going.
Barely.
Talking about Mount Ayr.
Ready?
Oh, okay. So, some names I just like. I don't care if it's a dump. I don't care. I like the name. Wanamaker. I love that name. Wanamaker was the name of the post office at Salem. But you can't call it the Salem post office. You know why? There's already a Salem, Iowa. So they had to submit a name that, before you got here, I was saying, when you open a post office, you have to submit a name to the federal government because they're the ones that run the post office. So, we're going to get to it in a minute, but a name was submitted up in northern Ringgold County, Silver Street. Oh, that's a cool name. Yeah, we'll call our post office Silver Street. Feds wrote back and said, nope, there's already a Silver Street, Iowa. You got to pick something else. So they wanted to pick something that wasn't going to get rejected, and they picked Tingley. That was the original name of the Tingley post office. We'll get to that in a minute. But Wanamaker was in between Kellerton and Caledonia, more or less. And it had an evangelical church and a school. Not much for stores or hotels or anything like that, but it was a community. Because again, it was miles away from a town, miles away from a railroad. You got to have a community every few miles. So the post office at Salem was called Wanamaker. And the corner down there is still called Salem Corner. And there is a sign up there indicating this is where the school was and this is where the church was. Blackmore Corner was named after James Blackmore, and that was, like 4 or 5 miles south of Elston. And again, there was no other towns around. There was no church or school in Blackmore. The nearest church was High Point, and it was a mile west. There was a school a mile north, and there was a school a mile south. But what Blackmore had was a trading post, a general store. And it had a post office till about 1900. And it was a community. It was a thriving community. All the communities were. There was a huge rural population in Ringgold County 100 years ago. 120, 100, 40 years ago. So, are we getting near the end? What time is it? Did I do Tingley yet?
Nope.
Shannon City, I told you about Shannon City. They submitted the name Shannon and it got rejected because there's already a Shannon, Iowa. But the people in Shannon City didn't know that. You can't pick up a map and get into the index. And so they got rejected, and so they submitted the name Shannon City. The Chicago Great Western came through in 1887, and Shannon City sprang up as a result of that. Tingley was on the CB&Q. I told you about the town of Eugene. It was exactly in between Shannon City and Tingley. So when Tingley came first, half of Eugene moved to Tingley. And then when the Chicago Great Western came through, the last half of Eugene moved to Shannon City. So Shannon City and Tingley both started off with businessmen, business buildings, doctors, city officials. So they both got off to a really good start because of that. They didn't start from scratch. They were part of another town. That was helpful to them. Beaconsfield became a town in 1882 because of the Humiston and Shenandoah, and they are named after Lord Beaconsfield. Supposedly, the first resident of Beaconsfield was a blacksmith named Peter McAbbott, and I figure he was British, because I think he named the town, and it was named after Lord Beaconsfield, who I don't know what he's lord over, but he's in England. Tingley's kind of complicated. Tingley, Cornwall actually lived in Union County, Sand Creek Township, Union County. You go north of Elston about 5 miles, and that's where Tingley, Cornwall lived. Well, the other post office in the area was Union Hill, and it was pretty rough terrain over in there, so they wanted a post office closer to the Afton Mount Air line, which had a stagecoach run daily. So they started this post office called Silver Street. Well, that got shot down. They changed it to Tingley, and it was at Tingley Cornwall's house in Union County. And then they wanted to get closer yet to the stagecoach line and moved it to Edgar Sheldon's house, but kept the name Tingley. So now it's in Ringgold County. Edgar Sheldon was probably more famous for being Frank Sheldon's dad, but he was big in keeping the operations going up in north central Ringgold County. You had to have community leaders. You had to have them. And that's what Edgar Sheldon was. He was a community leader. So Tingley, the post office at Tingley existed more than 10 years before the town did. So when the railroad came through in 1882, they moved the post office to what would be Tingley, and the post office was already named Tingley. So the town of Tingley got named after the post office, not the other way around. So, and the Cornwall family is very historic. The Cornwall house at Elston, they're a very historic pioneer family, which is being restored, by the way. I was up there a week or two ago. They sell cinnamon rolls in Elston on Saturday morning. And I saw a truck, and I got to know what's going on, and it was Guy Fisher. And I go, what are you doing? He said, I'm jacking up, I'm leveling off the house because they're going to put a steel roof on it. So anyway, I took pictures of it before I don't like things to be modified, but if they're going to be modified, I want a picture of the original. So I got pictures. And I understand you have to level out a house before you put steel roof on it. So where are we? Tingley. And Tingley got off to a great start. Tingley, though, then here's their claim to fame. Of all the towns that had tremendous fires, Tingley had more devastating business fires than any other town. But they usually bounced back. They would rebuild with brick, or in the early days they rebuilt with wood, and they burned down too. I cannot believe the number of fires Tingley had. Now, it wasn't the most devastating fire. The most devastating fire happened in Malloy in 1931 because of the size of the town and because of the Depression. They didn't rebuild. They rebuilt the church, and that was it. So the business district never got rebuilt back, except for Frank Carr's grocery and gas station. So it was timing. And Tingley had 600 people in 1900. So they had a tax base, they could rebuild. They had the energy, and and Malloy was on the Chicago Great Western. By this time, that's a mainline railroad. They weren't stopping at every little town anymore. So it was just location and timing. That Malloy fire was the most devastating in the county, but Tingley suffered the most in dollar amount. They just had a fire all the time. It burned down the whole business district, and they would rebuild it. It would burn down again 10 years later. They had the worst luck with fire. You hear about other towns having worse luck, but if you do the math, Tingley had the worst. Watterson started out as a post office called Thomas, and then the name got changed to Poinier, and then they lost their post office, and they fought back and got another post office called Watterson. And Watterson was named after a political speaker of the day. And some guys weren't politicians, they just went around speaking about issues and politics, and there wasn't much entertainment in those days. But Watterson, I can't remember the guy's first name now, but he was a public speaker, and he went around speaking a great deal. So Watterson was another one of those communities. The school was at least a quarter of a mile away, maybe a half a mile away. And there was no church in Watterson, but there was a blacksmith shop and a general store, and in later years a furniture store, which kind of turned into an antique shop. It was O.B. and Hazel Davis, if you remember them. And Watterson, again, it was so far away from everything else, needed a community there. And the Watterson store stayed open until the early 60s. And I remember Gene Motzinger telling me that the rural mailman in that area would eat his lunch at the Watterson store, and it'd just be bologna and crackers. But that Watterson Road was the first county road in the county to get gravel in 1935. Of course, the Watterson Quarry helped out with that. So, and that was a part of the county that didn't have any high schools, so that was the first bus route. But anyway, Watterson's got an interesting history. They had it going on in the old days just like everybody else. There was a little community, very small, called Kew, K-E-W. And Kew was named after the Q in CB&Q, Chicago, Burlington, Quincy. And it was halfway between Tingley and not Diagonal, halfway between Tingley and Diagonal. And all it was a flag stop and a store. But the store was in the news quite a bit. Q is another one of those words you can put in the search box, and nothing else comes up, just Q. It's not like Smith or Jones or Church or Depot. You can type in Q and only get Q. So, but it did go out kind of early in the early 1890s. They lost their post office. It wasn't really a community. It was just a store and a flag stop. But it was a location more than anything else. Mortimer, I don't know much about or how it was named, but it was, you go south of Shannon City a mile and then 4 miles west, and that was Mortimer. And they had a school and a church, and it was a community, and the formation of Knowlton kind of hurt them because Knowlton was about 3 miles south. So a lot of people moved from Mortimer to Knowlton or that area. We're going to get into Knowlton. Knowlton's one of my favorite ghost towns, and probably everybody, a lot of people, because where did Knowlton go? Knowlton was incorporated, I think, in 1890. So the Chicago Great Western goes through in 1887. Now the surveying crews were there the year before. Everybody knew where the tracks were going to be laid. So the Chicago Great Western built coal chutes at what would become Knowlton. Well, it's not too hard to figure out, hey, if the trains are going to stop here, let's build a town here. And Knowlton was started by a guy named William Sherrill and James McGinty. And they built the first buildings, and they were the go-getters and the town officers, and Knowlton sprang up rather quickly and had a good business going until Goshen said, wait a minute, there's a crossing, a railroad crossing, where Diagonal is today. There was a railroad crossing. The CB&Q and the Chicago Great Western. The Humison and Shenandoah became the CB&Q. So there's a railroad crossing. Goshen's a mile away and Knowlton's a mile away. Goshen says to Knowlton, hey, let's move over to the crossing. The trains are going to stop there and passengers are going to change and it's going to be a big town. Knowlton said, we don't need you. We got the coal chutes. Goodbye. So Goshen moved 1 mile east and became the town of Diagonal in 1889. That put them 1 mile south of Knowlton on the same railroad line. That's not going to work. The railroad is going to say, wait a minute, why are we stopping twice in 1 mile? That takes a lot of time and money. And so Diagonal and Knowlton battled it out. Diagonal won. Now the coal chute thing, that ended up going away because the Chicago Great Western ended up building coal chutes at Blockton. And Diagonal was smart enough to erect a water tank at Diagonal. And it was a lot of decision making, maneuvering, positioning, and working with the railroad. And Knowlton started to slip slide away in 1906. That's when their last newspaper was published, 1906. Up to 1905, Diagonal and Knowlton had the same population, 322, I think it was. So they were still neck and neck in 1905. In 1906, Knowlton lost its newspaper, never got another one. And then the wheels came off completely about 1920. They lost their post office, high school closed. Knowlton had a high school. They had a girls' basketball team, but not a boys' basketball team. The boys worked and farmed. In the spring and fall, they didn't go to school, they worked. Anyway, Knowlton lost its post office, the depot. Dr. Watson moved from Knowlton to Diagonal in 1918, and there was no coming back. But the official disincorporation, or however you say it, happened in 1926. The Knowlton store stayed open into the early 30s and probably got knocked out by the Depression more than anything else. But it's just, I read those newspapers and just the littlest things, a business moving from Knowlton to Diagonal, a meat market, kind of important. But you know, you think, okay, they lost one business. Over time, they lost them all. There was a foundry in Knowlton that employed a lot of people. It burned in 1908 or 09. And the owner planned to rebuild, but didn't. And I don't know why. There's a lot of details that are missing. You read the old newspapers and you say, wait a minute, how come you're not giving any details? Well, the newspapers relied on correspondence. They relied on people in Knowlton to write them a letter, what's going on, and mail it to them. And sometimes the correspondent didn't know or didn't care about the details. Or, this is what I've come to believe, there were things that were common knowledge at that time that didn't need to be reported because it was common knowledge, but not to me because I don't know what they're talking about. They knew in that day, they knew in 1909 what that meant, but I don't know what it means. So there's a lot of stuff I read and I go, oh man, you could have helped me out there and you didn't do it. Reading didn't have a newspaper in 1905, and that was the year their church got blown down. The Methodist church got blown down. So I have to rely on correspondence in the Mount Air paper, and their correspondent was not regular. They might supply information for a month and then not again for 4 or 5 months. So I would love to get into the Grant City newspapers and read about Reading in 1905. Because it was once thought that the Reading Methodist Church was built in 1884. And the first one was, but it blew down in 1905. And I've got enough evidence that I can say for sure that happened, but boy, the details are really lacking. And you just want to grab the correspondent and go, give me some meat on that bone. And you're trying to put 2 and 2 together, but you don't have 2 and 2. You have 1.5 and 1.5, and equals 3. But I just love reading the old newspapers. I didn't at first because I didn't know where that was or who those people were, but I do now. And so it makes a lot more sense today. But, and Diagonal's newspaper office burned to the ground in December 1917 and took its old newspapers with it. So, to get early Diagonal history, we have to go to Mount Ayr paper, Clearfield, Reading, and they do have Diagonal news in them, Shannon City, but boy, you have to look and look and read a whole page to get one little sentence of what I call meat on the bone. And there's a lot of fluff and filler, and I've spent years reading old newspapers, but I found some interesting things. I want to touch on a couple of those things. There's not much information in old newspapers about saloons. They were looked down upon, they weren't promoted, they weren't endorsed, they weren't glorified. Communities didn't like them. So there's hardly ever any news on them. What I found out was, even if you didn't have a saloon, you could still get booze. Pharmacists could legally distribute alcoholic beverages for the culinary purposes, sacramental purposes, and medicinal purposes. So the local druggist was the drug dealer of the day. And you could get whiskey, whatever you wanted, from the druggist. He had a permit. And there was a druggist in Knowlton, I think it was 1905, maybe earlier. He got arrested for selling booze illegally. If he got a permit, I don't know how that happens, but soon after that, he moved to Arispe, which is on the same railroad line. But he just left town. Then in around 1910, a woman in Kellerton tried to sue a druggist for getting her husband drunk. And it went all the way to court. She did not win her case, but it did go all the way to trial. So that's where you went to get your book. I mean, if there was a saloon, great. But if there wasn't, you went to the drugstore and got your whiskey. Sports, baseball was huge, always was. From the very beginning, little communities like Lee had baseball teams. Knowlton had a baseball team, a good team, and they went around and played. Leon would come to Mount Ayr, Bedford would go to Malloy. I mean, it was huge. Anytime there was a 4th of July celebration, there was a baseball game. There was, some guys were so good that they would go play on another team for money. Homer Holland was one of those people. He got murdered in 1901, but he was probably Ringgold County's best athlete. He won a bunch of awards at Drake Relays in Chicago. There was an amateur track and field event in Chicago. He won a bunch of gold medals, had to give them all up because it was later deemed he was a professional, and he was. He anything he could do to make money, running, jumping, baseball. He was a professional baseball player. Baseball was huge. Gambling was sometimes a problem. And that's how Homer Holland died, from a gambling debt. Football wasn't popular because you need a football field for one thing. It's one thing to have a ball or a glove or a bat, but you need a 100-yard football field. And football was slow to catch on. But the earliest I see football is in 1888. Some kids from Kellerton pooled their money and ordered a football through a catalog, which they kicked through a plate glass window. You know, footballs are kind of odd shaped, and I'm sure it took a funny bounce. But the earliest game I've seen was 1898, and Mount Ayr used to go down and play Graceland College all the time, although there were fights because of cheating. Think about it, 1898, Graceland's playing Mount Ayr. Who's got the rule book? Who are the referees? Are the lines marked correctly? I'm sure there was a lot of debate. Blockton used to, in the late 1890s, Blockton used to come over to Reading and play the Reading football team. It wasn't a high school team. Mount Ayr was the only high school to have a football team. But it was red hot for a few years, football was. Basketball, the reason these brick schools got built when they did was because everybody needed a gymnasium.